Hi everyone, Reese here, and welcome to ctrl-alt-rees. In this video, I'm performing an audio upgrade on my Acorn Archimedes A305, including removing some unnecessary filtering components and fitting an upgraded op-amp chip, which should transform the audio output from this to this. So what's so special about this Acorn Archimedes? Well, this particular machine was the very first to be powered by an ARM CPU, which was invented by Acorn, and is now the most popular CPU architecture in the world, and used in the vast majority of mobile phones and tablets, set-top boxes, and maybe most famously the Raspberry Pi. Apple also recently announced that all of their desktop and laptop computers will be moving to ARM later this year, meaning that this relatively obscure British machine is still having a big impact 30 years later. Now my Archimedes here is the absolute basic bare-bones budget launch model, the A305. It was launched in 1987 with an 8MHz ARM2 CPU and 512K of RAM, and was originally running the Arthur operating system, although this one was obviously heavily upgraded by a previous owner, as we'll see shortly. Originally, this machine would have used its tinny little mono internal speaker for output, or if it was paired with something like this AKF11 monitor, the tinny little internal mono speaker built into that. But the Archimedes had a trick up its sleeve, and that came in the form of a stereo headphone output on the back. Unfortunately, in their infinite wisdom, Acorn decided to heavily filter that headphone output as if it was still using that tinny little mono speaker, meaning that anyone with decent headphones or hi-fi speakers like I use really got a rubbish deal. Thankfully, it's relatively easy to remove those extra filtering components, and for an extra inexpensive boost in quality, it's also possible to fit an uprated op-amp chip, which you may remember from my previous video. As this is such a historically important machine, I didn't want to do anything that couldn't be undone at a later date, so you'll no doubt be pleased to hear that this mod is completely reversible and non-destructive. Anyway, I've waffled on far too much now, so let's get this show on the road and I'll explain as I go. So this is the A305 motherboard. I believe it's supposed to slot out of the back, but because of the upgrades installed in mine, it's actually easier to remove the front of the machine and carefully manoeuvre it out that way. I've also removed the CPU just to prevent it getting damaged on the way out. On the subject of that ARM CPU, this is the upgrade that's been fitted at some point by a previous owner. It's an ARM3, which was introduced in 1989. This one has a 50MHz crystal, meaning it's clocked at 25MHz. This would have been a monumental performance boost at the time and would have even outperformed much later machines like the A3000 in their stock configuration. On the right hand side of the board we can see that this ARC has had a 4MB RAM upgrade fitted, up from the standard 512K that it would have had from the factory. To support this upgrade and the new CPU, this machine has been fitted with an upgraded memory controller chip. Just above that is the CPU socket, which would originally have housed that ARM2 running at 8MHz. Incidentally, all of Acorn's ARM CPUs were manufactured for them by VLSI Technology, a Silicon Valley chip fabricator based in San Jose. Finally, we have the operating system ROMs. Again, these have been upgraded from the original Arthur OS that it originally shipped with in 1987 to the later full-blown RISC OS. This machine is running version 3.11 from 1992. So as far as our audio upgrade is concerned, this is the op-amp chip which I upgraded in my previous video. I desoldered the original chip and fitted a socket in its place. As the solder on this board is old and the PCB traces and solder pads quite fragile, I added new solder and a lot of flux first to help things along. Acorn originally fitted a cheap LM324 op-amp, but I've replaced this with a Burr-Brown OPA4134PA chip. This one cost me £4 on eBay. Incidentally, the Burr-Brown Corporation were an electronics company based in Tucson, Arizona, and were founded in 1956. They specialised in components for high-end consumer audio equipment and were acquired by Texas Instruments in the year 2000. The Burr-Brown brand no longer exists as its own separate entity. In my previous video I determined that there was zero audible difference between the old and the new op-amps, and it seems most of you in the comments agreed. It was then that a commenter called Zarchos very helpfully suggested that I remove the extra filtering components, which is what I'm going to do now. Zarchos is a well-known figure in the Archimedes community, particularly on the Stardot forums, which are very active and supportive, so well worth a visit. He also has some great videos on his own YouTube channel, which I'll link above and down in the description, including a few demonstrating this audio mod using some modern demos and the freeware QTM Pro Tracker player. So if you're interested in using the Archimedes for music, definitely go and check it out. I also spotted that he's in the process of porting Shadow of the Beast to the Archimedes, so I'll definitely be keeping an eye on that project. Of course, I should also give credit to the person who first shared this modification, who was another Stardot user by the name of Steve Harrison. Steve also wrote QTM and made some excellent music patches for the Lemmings games, so he knows what he's talking about. I'll link to his website and his original guide in the description below. Anyway, onwards with the mod. This is the upgraded op-amp, which is labelled IC13 on the motherboard. Later on I'll disconnect legs 2 and 13 of this chip, which of course is very easy and non-destructive because it's now socketed. The components that we need to remove from the motherboard are as follows, and as this is a stereo amplifier, there are 2 of each of course. 2 capacitors labelled C22 and C23. 2 resistors labelled R40 and R42. And 2 transistors labelled Q9 and Q11. We'll also need to bridge pins 1 to 3 and 7 to 9 on this internal audio header labelled PL2. As before, I'll add some new solder and some flux to help things along. The last thing we want to do is force anything and damage the traces or solder pads on the motherboard. So first I'll remove those 2 capacitors at C22 and C23. Now it's time to remove the 2 resistors at R40 and R42. Thankfully there's a lot of room around these, which makes getting the desoldering gun in there relatively easy. Finally, the transistors at Q9 and Q11. These were a little more awkward, but I eventually managed to persuade them out without damaging anything. Now I'll pop the op-amp out of its socket and bend legs 2 and 13 so that they're outside of the socket and no longer making contact. There's a notch in one end of the chip and the legs are numbered anti-clockwise from there, with pin 1 being top left. When inserting the chip, bend the disconnected legs so that they're flush with the outside of the socket to minimise the chance of them shorting out on anything. The last step of the mod is to bridge pins 1 to 3 and 7 to 9 of the internal audio header at PL2. The numbering is a bit confusing on this, so I'll put a diagram up on screen. This final step connects the unfiltered audio output from the op-amp directly to the audio output socket on the back of the motherboard. Now it's time to put everything back together and check whether it still works. Now of course, this wouldn't be a very good mod video without some before and after comparisons, and as I'm predominantly using this machine for gaming, I'm going to fire up some classics and let you hear the difference for yourselves. First up, Canon Fodder. Hopefully the difference is pretty plain to hear, but just in case, here's what the before and after recordings look like in a spectrum analyzer. As you can see, there's so much high frequency data that's just completely lost on the stock filtering setup. Now, Magic Pockets. Again, looking at the files in a spectrum analyzer reveals just how much we were missing before. The hi-hats, for example, were completely inaudible. It's as if they weren't even there. So there we have it. Big thanks again to Zarchos, aka Xavier, and Steve Harrison over on the Stardot forums for all of your help and advice on this mod. If you follow the link down in the description to the original post on Stardot, there's a much more detailed description there that also covers the later models of Archimedes where some of the components might be labelled slightly differently or be in slightly different places. Finally, if you enjoyed this video and found it useful, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or suggestions, let me know down in the comments. And if you aren't already a subscriber and want to see more of this kind of thing, remember to hit that subscribe button. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll hopefully see you around.